Welcome to the next chapter. It is reception, response, and coordination. An important feature of all living organisms is their ability to detect any external and internal changes in the environment, and not just detect. The same organism must also be able to respond to these changes if it has to survive. This ability to detect and, importantly, respond to changes in the environment is called sensitivity or irritability. The kind of variation which can produce a change in activity of part or the whole organism is called a stimulus. The change in activity by the organism is called a response. The parts of the body that receive the stimuli are known as receptors, while those that bring about the response are called effectors. Examples of receptors include the nerves, which receive stimuli like heat and pressure. Examples of effectors include the muscles, which bring about movement, and glands, which secrete chemicals in response to a stimulus. The process of reception and response involves an integrated system and internal control so that they bear some relationships necessary for a correct reaction. Unlike plants, animals have two different but related systems of coordination: the nervous system and the endocrine system. So, in order for sensitivity and response to be effected, there must be receptors to receive the stimulus, coordinators to integrate the information and interpret it, transmission system to conduct the stimulus, and effectors to respond to the stimuli. For instance, nerve endings on your skin receive the stimuli, say pain. This is transmitted via the sensory neurons to the brain, the coordinating center, which sends a signal via the motor neurons to the muscles to effect the appropriate response, for example, contraction. Response to a variety of stimuli. Responses can be grouped according to the type of stimulus. This may involve movement of the whole or part of an organism in response to the stimulus. If the movement is towards the stimulus, then it is called positive response. Negative response is movement away from the stimulus. The major responses include taxis and tropism. Taxis is a locomotory response of a motile cell, for example gamete, or a whole organism in response to an external stimulus. The stimulus is unidirectional, which means it is from one direction. The responses are grouped according to the stimuli which causes them. Phototaxis is a response to variation in light intensity and direction. Aerotaxis is the response to variation in oxygen concentration. Osmotaxis is a response to variation in osmotic pressure. Rheotaxis is response to variation in direction of water or air currents. Chemotaxis is a response to variation in chemical substances. Thermotaxis is the locomotory response to temperature changes. Tactic responses enable the organisms to escape from harmful stimuli, for example excessive heat and predators. The organisms are also able to seek favorable habitats and acquire resources like nutrients and mates. Chemotaxis enables fertilization to take place. Reception, response, and coordination in plants. Plants do not possess parts in any way comparable to the organized nervous and sensory systems of animals. Their sensitivity is brought about by responses on parts of the plant. The responses are in the form of growth, movement, or tropisms. Tropisms. Tropism is a growth movement of part of a plant in response to a unidirectional external stimulus. Tropic movements are shown by growth curvatures of plant parts. These responses are either positive or negative. These growth movements are often slow, but growth rate is controlled by plant hormones called auxins. Tropism, like tactic responses, are named according to the stimuli which evoke them. Phototropism is a growth curvature in response to the direction and intensity of light. Shoots are positively phototrophic while roots show negative phototropism. Geotropism is the growth curvature in response to gravity. Roots are positively geotropic while shoots are negatively geotropic. Hydrotropism refers to the curvature in response to water or moisture. Plants' roots are positively hydrotropic. Thigmotropism is a growth curvature in response to contact with a solid object. Thigmotropism is shown by tendrils or climbing stems which twine around objects like branches or tree stems. Root tips show negative thigmotropism when they grow avoiding solid obstacles such as rocks. Nastic responses. Nastic responses are non-directional movements of parts of a plant in response to diffuse stimuli. Such responses include folding of leaves in hot weather, opening and closing of flowers in response to intensity of light, and the closing of leaves in Mimosa pudica when touched. These movements are brought about by Tagger pressure changes at the leaf and petal bases of certain plants. At this basis, there are pressure-sensitive swellings called the pulvini, which through loss or gain of turgidity bring about this movement. Nastic responses are also grouped according to the type of stimuli that evoke them. Nictinasty or sleep movement are movements in response to differences in light intensity and temperature changes of the day and night as seen in sunflower. If the response is specifically for light, then it is called photonasty, open in the presence of light and closed in its absence. And if it is specifically for temperature changes, then it is called thermonasty, as in flowers of some plants that open with increase in temperature and close with decrease in temperature. Haptonasty is the response to touch. The touch reaction in plants is most dynamic to the sensitive plant, Mimosa pudica. The leaves of this plant will close rapidly if they or their stems attached. Chemonasty is the response to the presence of specific chemical substances of nitrogenous compounds, such as urea and ammonium compounds found in insectivorous plants like sundew. Therefore, when the insect is trapped by the tentacles of the plant, the insect provides the chemical stimulus for the release of digestive enzymes by the plant. Auxins and tropism. Do you remember the hormone auxins? Among its many roles, auxins, and in particular indole acetic acid, stimulates rapid cell division and elongation in plants. In phototropism, when light is placed on one side of a growing plant, the plant grows towards it. This behavior is due to auxins. If the tip of the plant is covered with a cap, thus protected from the light, the plant continues to grow upwards without bending. This suggests that there is something at the tip of the plant that controls the direction of growth. If the plant is put on its side, the shoot quickly recovers its orientation and grows upwards. This is negative geotropism. These pea seeds are growing in the dark, and yet the roots are growing downwards and the shoots are growing upwards. The roots and the shoots must be responding to gravity, but in different ways. These growth responses are due to indole acetic acid, a type of auxin hormone. In phototropism, a light-sensitive mechanism at the tip of the plant promotes the active transport of the auxin to the shaded part of the stem. This produces cell growth and elongation in the area. Because this part outgrows the illuminated area, the stem bends towards the source of light. A gravity-sensitive mechanism at the tip triggers active transport of auxins, producing growth of the stem on the lower side, causing the stem to bend upwards. Reaction, response, and coordination in animals. Now, animals as well need to detect and respond suitably to change in the environment. Whereas lower animals possess simple structures, higher animals have evolved elaborate structures for detection and coordination of the affecting responses. Irritability in animals is more complex than in plants. Irritability in animals is brought about by the nervous system. In arthropods, the nervous system consists of peripheral nerves and a ventral nerve cord. In the head region, the nerve fibers are concentrated to form cerebral, acting as a brain for effective coordination. Arthropods also possess sense organs such as eyes, antennae, sacci, and halteres for detecting stimuli. In higher animals such as vertebrates, irritability is brought about by a more elaborate nervous system or neurosensory systems and the endocrine or hormonal system. The nervous or neurosensory system provides the quickest means of communication in animals. So we start with a look at the nervous system in animals. The mammalian nervous system consists of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. It receives and integrates impulses from the receptors and then relays them to the effector organs. It is the center of coordination. Peripheral nervous system is made up of sensory nerves and transmit nerve impulses from the receptors in the sensory organs to the central nervous system, and motor nerves that transmit impulses from central nervous system to effector organs. Structure and functions of nerve cells. The nerve cell or neuron is the basic functional unit of the nervous system. It is a cell which is modified to transmit impulses. A nerve impulse is an electrical signal that is transmitted along a nerve fiber. The neuron consists of a cell body or centron and extensions called dendrites. In some neurons, one of the dendrites is elongated to form an axon. Each axon is filled with a spherical cytoplasm called exoplasm, which is usually continuous with the cytoplasm of the cell body. The axon is bound by a thin membrane which continues with plasma membrane of the cell body. The axon is in turn enclosed by a fatty sheath called the myelin or the medullated sheath. The myelin sheath is surrounded by neurilemma, which is the membrane of the Schwann cell, but lies in intimate contact with the axon. The Schwann cell secretes the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is also broken at 1 mm intervals by constrictions called nodes of Ranvier. The nodes of Ranvier help to propagate the nerve impulse and speed up the transmission of an impulse. The myelin sheath helps insulate the axon. The neurons are described as unipolar, bipolar, or multipolar according to how many dendrites project from the cell body. The dendrites of the cell body make contact with neighboring neurons in the central nervous system, while the terminal dendrites at the end of the axon make contact with effector organs. Several neurons link up to transmit impulses from a sensory organ to the central nervous system and also from the central nervous system to effector organs. There are 3 types of neurons grouped according to the direction of impulse conduction. The sensory neurons, also called afferent neurons, motor neurons, also called efferent neurons, and relay neurons, also called connector, intermediate, or associative neurons. The sensory neurons. These nerve cells link the sense organs such as the ear, eye, skin, nose, and tongue with the central nervous system. Its cell body is situated off the axon and outside the central nervous system. Its receptor dendrites are located in the sense organ, while the terminal dendrites are located in the central nervous system. Its function is to transmit nerve impulses from sense organs to the central nervous system. The motor neuron. This nerve cell links the central nervous system with the effectors such as muscle fibers and glands. Its cell body is located at one end of the axon with the central nervous system. Its motor endplates terminate in a muscle or gland. It transmits nerve impulses from the central nervous system to the effectors. Relay neurons. This neuron links a sensory nerve with the motor neuron through small gaps or neural junctions called synapses. It is therefore a bipolar or multipolar nerve. The entire neuron is located within the central nervous system. They are non-myelinated. The main function of the relay neuron is to relay nerve impulses between sensory and motor neurons. And now the central nervous system. The central nervous system is composed of the brain and the spinal cord and their associated nerves. The brain is a delicate nervous organ which is encased in a body structure called the skull or cranium. It is enveloped by a system of protective membranes called meninges. The human brain is divided into three major regions: the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. Each of these regions consists of various parts. The forebrain consists of the cerebrum, the thalamus, hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland. The cerebrum is a highly developed part consisting of left and right cerebral hemispheres. It is important for integration of sensory impulses such as vision, hearing, and taste. It controls voluntary body movements like limbs, lips, and neck. This part of the brain also controls learning, memory, and human individuality. The thalamus is an important relay center. It contains receptors for pain and pleasure. The hypothalamus is located below the thalamus. It has receptors for homeostatic functions such as thermoregulation and osmoregulation. It controls appetite and sleep. The pituitary gland is attached to the hypothalamus and projects downwards from there. It is the master endocrine gland controlling the rest of the endocrine glands. The hindbrain. The major parts of the hindbrain are the cerebellum and medulla oblongata. The main functions of the cerebellum is the maintenance of body balance and posture. It is achieved by controlling and coordinating muscular movements. The medulla oblongata controls involuntary activities such as breathing, swallowing, salivation, and vomiting. It controls dilation or constriction of blood vessels, thereby influencing blood pressure. Cranial nerves. These nerves arise from the brain and form a part of the peripheral nervous system associated with receptors and effectors in the head. In human beings, there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves confined to the head and neck. These may be purely sensory, motor, or mixed. Some examples of the cranial nerves are optic, auditory, olfactory, and facial nerves. In addition, there are sensory and motor nerves which innervate the face and jaws. The 10th cranial nerve, that is the vagus nerve, innervates the heart, lungs, diaphragm, and the gut. Spinal cord. The spinal cord is the posterior extension from the brain to the tail. It is enclosed in the meninges and protected by the vertebral column. The spinal cord is made up of gray matter and white matter. The gray matter is H-shaped and surrounds a central canal which is filled with the cerebrospinal fluid. This gray matter relays information between the sensory and motor neurons. It consists of cell bodies and dendrites of relay and motor neurons. This gives it a darker appearance, hence the term gray matter. Surrounding the gray matter is the white matter, which consists of the axons of the sensory and motor neurons. The myelin sheath of these neurons gives this part its shiny white appearance. Arising from the spinal cord are dorsal and ventral roots of spinal nerves. Spinal nerves innervate the skeletal muscles of the limbs and trunk. In association with cranial nerves, they control all organs of the body, below the head, like the urinary bladder, the gut, liver, kidney, and lungs. Reflex action. A reflex action is a rapid response to a stimulus. There are two types of reflex actions, simple and conditioned. In a simple reflex action, there is a specific single and automatic response to a particular stimulus. It is the simplest form of reflex and does not rely on learning. This includes withdrawal of a finger from a sharp or hot object, blinking of the eye, knee-jerk response, coughing and sneezing, amongst others. In reflex action, the dendrites of sensory neurons quickly relay a message in form of electric impulse via sensory nerves to the spinal cord. The spinal cord then sends information impulse via the motor nerves to effectors, that is muscles or glands. The reflex action generally involves the spinal cord for quick response to specific stimulus, or otherwise the thinking process of the brain may take time and delay the response, which may harm the animal. However, information input also goes on to reach the brain where the thinking process occurs. The path taken by a nerve impulse in a reflex action is called a reflex arc. When a hand accidentally touches a hot object, the heat is sensed by thermoreceptors in the skin. The receptor triggers nerve impulses in sensory neurons. Sensory neurons transmit this message to the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, the impulse is passed on to the interneuron, which in turn passes it to the motor neuron. The motor neurons transmit the instruction to the muscles of the hand. The arm muscles contract and pulls the hand away from the hot object. This is also called the spinal reflex. Reflex arcs have evolved in animals because the thinking process of the brain is relatively slow. Reflex arcs have efficient ways of functioning in the absence of true thought process. So in a reflex arc, sensory information is processed at the level of spinal cord, resulting in action without involvement of the brain. So if one's fingers are burned by a candle flame, the hand that receives the painful stimulus is rapidly removed from the flame with a jerking motion. At the same time, the brain is receiving information indicating that a painful event occurred in the hand. It is important to understand that although the brain may perceive the painful stimulus, the reflex arc acts to retrieve the hand without direct input from the brain. Transmission of nerve impulses. The neural system interprets and transfers information as changes in electrical activities. Some chemicals are neurotoxic because they disrupt the electric functions of the nervous and muscular systems. This often results in poisoning and is a common approach in designing insecticides. All cells, including the nerves and the muscle cells, have an outer membrane that maintains electrical charge between the outside and the inside of the cell. The outside of the neuron is positive and the inside is negative. The electrical charge is a result of an equal charge distribution of electrically charged chemicals called ions. In a normal cell, most of the positive sodium ions are located on the outside of the membrane. This is a non-conducting cell and is said to be in a resting membrane potential. Sodium channels are proteins embedded on the cell membrane that can open up and allow sodium ions to diffuse into the cell because of their higher concentration on the outside. Generally, sodium channels are closed and the sodium ions are unable to move into the cell. Occasionally, some sodium ions leak into the cell, but they are quickly removed by other proteins called sodium pumps. When a nerve impulse forms, the sodium channels open and the sodium pump is inactivated in the region of the impulse. Opening the sodium channels allows the positive sodium ions to flow into the axon along their concentration gradient. In the region of active potential, the outside of the membrane becomes negative and the inside becomes positive. This is depolarization. The localized depolarization of the membrane causes nearby sodium channels to open ahead of the impulse so that depolarization spreads progressively forward along the axon membrane. As the negative depolarization of the impulse passes along the axon, the sodium channels regain their ability to close and the sodium pumps behind the impulse reactivate to pump sodium ions out of the neuron and re-establish the normal polarized state of the membrane with the outside positive and the inside negative. In this manner, a wave of negative depolarization is conducted along the length of the axon as an action potential and conveys the information about the stimulus from one end of the axon to the other at incredibly high speeds. Next, synapse. The synapse is a connection between two neurons where information is transferred and interpreted. It is a major site of target by most of the neurotoxins. On the screen is a group of neurons that represent a system of network through which information is interchanged within the nervous system. Information comes into the network and is distributed between the neurons at their synapse. The synapse consists of a presynaptic neuron that brings in the information signal. The synaptic junction where the information is transferred from the presynaptic axon to the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron, and the postsynaptic axon that carries the information away to other neurons. Information is encoded and transferred to the nervous system as action potential. Action potentials are discrete regions of negative depolarization that are propagated actively along the axon membrane. So let's see the organization of a synapse. The synapse consists of a button-like ending at the tip of branches at the end of the presynaptic axon. This presynaptic button is separated by a gap from the dendrite of the postsynaptic neuron. The synaptic membrane of the postsynaptic dendrite has numerous sodium channels that are associated with proteins called receptors. Receptors can detect special chemicals released by the presynaptic axon terminal. When an action potential enters the presynaptic axon terminal, the terminal releases a special chemical called neurotransmitter, like the acetylcholine. The message encoded in the frequency of the presynaptic action potential is converted by the presynaptic axon into neurotransmitter chemicals that are released and carry the message across the synaptic gap to the postsynaptic dendrite. The neurotransmitter chemicals bind to the receptor proteins associated with the sodium channels of the postsynaptic membrane. Binding of the neurotransmitter chemicals stimulates the sodium channels to open and allow positive sodium ions to flow into the postsynaptic dendrite. Transfer of sodium ions to the inside of the postsynaptic membrane results in the outside of the postsynaptic membrane becoming negatively charged in the region of open sodium channels. The negative depolarization of the postsynaptic areas spread over the sensitive postsynaptic region and generates a new action potential that is carried away by the postsynaptic axon. To stop the depolarization of the postsynaptic region by the neurotransmitter chemicals, enzymes destroy the neurotransmitter chemicals. Once the neurotransmitter chemical is destroyed, the postsynaptic sodium channels close. The sodium ions are transported outside of the postsynaptic membrane by the reactivated sodium pumps, and the outside of the postsynaptic membrane returns to its normal positive charge. In the case of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, the enzyme that destroys the neurotransmitter is called acetylcholinesterase. Neurotoxins such as insecticides inhibit this enzyme. This means that the neurotransmitter chemical remains bound to the receptors of the postsynaptic membrane, hence keeping the sodium channels open. This results in sustained depolarization at the neuromuscular junction, causing muscle twitching that is seen in insects sprayed with these chemicals. The endocrine system. Now, this is another system of coordination in animals in addition to the nervous system. The endocrine system comprises of endocrine glands that are ductless, which secrete hormones. Interaction between these hormones forms a communication network in the body of an animal. Hormones are organic compounds which are either protein or steroids in nature. They are produced in minute quantities in cells in one part of the body and transported by bloodstream to the other parts of the same organism where they produce the response. Those parts of an organism that respond are called the target organs. The major center of the endocrine system is the pituitary gland. However, endocrine system is also controlled by the hypothalamus, part of the nervous system, located in the diencephalon or interbrain. This is where the nervous system and the endocrine system shake hands. The hypothalamus is involved in control of our body temperature, emotions, and sexual activity, among many other things. These activities are initiated by the hypothalamus based on negative feedback. The hypothalamus accomplishes this in three ways. 1. The hypothalamus regulates the anterior pituitary gland by stimulating or inhibiting the production of pituitary hormones. 2. The hypothalamus releases hormones directly into the circulatory system through the posterior pituitary gland. And 3. The hypothalamus controls the endocrine cells of the adrenal medulla, which produce a very important hormone called adrenaline. The pituitary gland is about the size of a pea and is the master gland because it regulates all the other glands and tissues that comprise the endocrine system. It is located at the base of the brain and is connected to the hypothalamus, which in turn regulates its activities. The pituitary gland has two lobes, the posterior lobe and the anterior lobe. The anterior pituitary gland is connected directly to the hypothalamus by a capillary network called the hypophyseal portal system. Two types of regulatory hormones are produced by the hypothalamus and transported directly to the anterior pituitary gland, releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. These hormones in turn regulate the production of hormones by the anterior pituitary gland. The hormones produced by the anterior pituitary gland include thyroid stimulating hormone or TSH, which triggers the thyroid gland to secrete thyroid hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone or ACTH stimulates secretion of hormones in the adrenal gland. Follicle stimulating hormone or FSH stimulates sperm production in male testes as well as estrogen hormone secretion and egg development in ovaries. Prolactin or PRL stimulates the formation of mammary glands in the female and production of milk. Luteinizing hormone LH induces ovulation in females and stimulates estrogen and progesterone hormone secretion in preparation for pregnancy. In males, it stimulates the production of testosterone hormone in the testes. And growth hormone or GH targets cells in the liver which are involved in the processing of food as well as stimulating cell growth and replication throughout the body. The posterior pituitary gland contains neuron cells that originate in the hypothalamus, and it releases two hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus. Antidiuretic hormone or ADH primarily targets the cells of the kidney and works to maintain proper balance of electrolytes in the bloodstream, but is also involved in maintaining proper blood volume and pressure. Oxytocin helps prepare the uterus during last stages of pregnancy for labor and delivery. After delivery, oxytocin is also involved in production of milk in the mammary glands. Now, most of the hormones we have examined so far are known as regulatory hormones. That is, they are involved in regulating hormones production in other glands and organs. The hypothalamus releases hormones that regulate the production of other hormones in the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland releases hormones which regulate the release of yet other hormones in yet other glands and organs. Let's now examine these other glands and their hormones. In fact, we are only going to look at adrenaline produced by the adrenal gland. In your own time, try and read about thyroxine, which is produced by the thyroid glands under the stimulation of the thyroid releasing hormone from the pituitary gland. Adrenal glands are attached to the abdominal cavity, one above each kidney. Each is made up of two distinct regions, the outer adrenal cortex and the inner one called the adrenal medulla. The medulla receives nerve impulses from the brain to produce the hormone adrenaline. The cortex have no nerve supply and produces a number of hormones called corticosteroids. Adrenaline prepares the body for emergency fight or flight. It is actually called a fight or flight hormone. When adrenaline is produced, the heartbeat increases, increasing the rate of circulation. The arterioles of the skin and digestive system constrict. In the liver, glycogen is converted to glucose. Skeletal muscles contract and relax, which can allow movement. Breathing rate becomes faster and deeper. Fats are converted to fatty acids, which are available in the blood for muscle contraction. All these processes are aimed at supplying the body with sufficient energy to either confront the situation or flee away from the threat. The human ear. The ear is a complex sense organ whose functions are to perceive sound and maintain balance. To understand the ear, let us first understand what sound is. The speakers you are listening to are vibrating, flexing in and out, causing a wave of pressure through the air. The frequency of these waves, or the speed at which the sound creating surface moves back and forth, affects the pitch of the sound. The level of pressure in each wave is directly related to how loud the sound is. The structure of the ear consists of three parts: an outer, middle, and inner ear. The outer ear consists of the pinna, which is a flap of skin and cartilage that partially covers the opening to the external auditory meters. It collects and concentrates sound waves into the auditory meters, which is a tube that directs the sound to the eardrum or the tympanic membrane. The middle ear is an air-filled cavity consisting of eardrum, ear ossicles, eustachian tube, oval and round windows. The eardrum is a thin, tough membrane that covers the external opening of the middle ear. It vibrates when hit by sound waves and transforms these waves into vibrations, and then transmits the information to the ear ossicles. The ossicles are three bones: malleus, incus, and stapes, all suspended by muscles that prevent excessive vibrations. The ossicles form a system of levers which amplifies and transmits the vibrations from the eardrum to the oval window. The eustachian tube is a tube connecting the middle ear with the pharynx and functions to equalize air pressure between the middle ear and the outer ear. The inner ear is a fluid-filled cavity connected to the middle ear by the oval window and consists of the cochlea. The outer part of the ear catches the sound waves from a source. It faces forward and has a specially designed structure of curves, helping us to determine the direction of sound and emphasize frequencies needed for human speech. When the sound waves are caught, they travel through the auditory meters or ear canal and strikes the eardrum. Now that we receive the sound, the middle ear transfers this energy. The smallest bones in the body, malleus, incus, and stapes, are set in motion. The malleus is attached to the eardrum, and as the sound passes along, the force is amplified by leverage until it arrives at the stapes, which act as a piston, creating waves through the fluid in the inner ear. The most significant increase in force comes from a system of hydraulic amplification. The stapes has a surface area of 3.2 millimeters squared, while the eardrum has a surface area of 55 millimeters squared. Using this, along with the leverage to the malleus and incus, the final pressure is 22 times greater than when the sound first arrived. Now we arrive at the most complicated part of hearing, that is the cochlea. In reality, it is coiled, but it is easier to understand it when straightened out. The stapes is causing pressure waves to travel through this structure. Along the inside wall is around 20 to 30,000 reed-like fibers. As the waves move along, they encounter fibers with the correct resonance frequency and energy is released. These fibers are not actually what gives us the signal that we heard something. There is a special structure next to these fibers containing hair cells. When the fibers resonate, they cause the hair cells to move, which then sends an electric impulse to the cochlear nerve and up to the brain. Certain pitches of sound will resonate in specific locations, and a louder sound will cause more hairs to move. Our brain interprets all the raw data, making it possible to enjoy a beautiful song and a lovely conversation. Just to think that this is happening in your head right now at full speed, and not just one but two of these sophisticated instruments are helping you have an amazing sense of hearing. Maintenance of body balance and posture. Balance is brought about by the semicircular canals and the vestibules. The semicircular canals are three tubular cavities containing endolymph. These canals lie mutually at right angles to each other and occupy the three planes of space. The two of these lie vertically and at right angles to one another, while the third is horizontal. Each semicircular canal has a swelling called ampulla at one end containing sensory cells. The semicircular canals maintain body balance and posture in relation to movement of the head. For example, when one spins and then stops suddenly, one feels dizzy. This is because the fluid is still in motion and stimulating sensory cells in the ampulla. The movement of the fluid stimulates the sensory cells, which trigger off nerve impulses which are transmitted via the auditory nerve to the brain for interpretation. In the brain, the information is relayed to the motor nerve, which carries motor impulses to the muscles of the body, which restore the body balance. Next is the human eye. Now, nature has located the eye close to the brain so that its messages can arrive there quickly. The eyeball is completely surrounded by a layer of soft fatty tissue placed within a bony socket where the eye is protected. Seen from inside, the protected position of the eyeball within its funnel-shaped eye socket is shown more clearly. Within this socket, the eye is suspended by sets of muscles which move the eye. The lateral rectus muscles move the eye right and left. Superior and inferior rectus muscles move the eye up and down. This white cord here is called the optic nerve and connects the eye to the brain. So this is the empty eye socket within the skull with its bony wall inside and a bony orbit in front. In front of the eyeball are two thin folds of skin, the eyelids, which protect the eye. From the edge of the eyelid are many hairs called eyelashes, which protect the eye from entry of small foreign particles. The eyebrows are raised portions of the skin above the eye, thickly covered with hair whose function is to prevent sweat and dust from entering into the eye. The capsule of the eyeball seems to have three layers. This thick, tough outer layer is called the sclera and serves to protect the delicate structure within. This transparent bulging portion is called the cornea. There is also a crystalline lens, which is one of the main parts of the human eye. The second layer is called the choroid. It consists of three different zones. The first zone is called choroid proper, and it is this part that carries nourishment to the tissues of the eye. The next zone is the ciliary body. This is a broad ring-shaped band of thin muscle fibers which plays a very active and vital role in the vision adjustment of the eye. The third zone is the iris, which expands and contracts the pupil much like the diaphragm of the camera. The innermost layer of the eyeball is called the retina, a very delicate membrane. The retina is actually the part of the optic nerve that transmits the light impulses to our brain. It is the most important and complex part of the eyeball, consisting of a complicated arrangement of rods and cones which convert light waves into nerve impulses. Between the lens and the cornea is the aqueous humor, consisting mostly of water and a little salt. This larger space between the eye is filled with vitreous humor, consisting chiefly of water mixed with salt and albumin. It is a highly transparent jelly-like substance and plays a very important role in the visual adjustment. The reflected light of the world enters through the crystal transparency of the cornea, pupil, aqueous humor, lens, and vitreous humor, which is a clear jelly-like substance that fills the middle of the eye and then projects to the photoreceptors of the retina. The macula is a very small area at the center of the retina that gives us a fine pinpoint center of vision. The area of the retina surrounding the macula gives us a peripheral or side vision. The retina converts the light rays into the signals that are sent to the optic nerves and then to the brain. Continuous adjustment of the pupil and lens regulates the entry and focusing of light. Every blink offers our eyes natural defense system. The tear film retains moisture and maintains visual acuity. Tear glands secrete the tear fluid, which contains important natural antiseptics to keep away bacteria, and drains through the tear duct into the nose after flushing and cleaning the entire eye surface, and thus the tear system washes away impurities to maintain a healthy eye. In forming an image, light from the object is refracted by the cornea, aqueous humor, and the lens through the vitreous humor and focused onto the fovea centralis on the retina. The image is recorded as real, inverted, and small. The photoreceptor cells become stimulated and nerve impulse is generated and transmitted by the optic nerve to the cerebrum part of the brain for interpretation. In the brain, the impulses are interpreted and the object appears real, upright, and normal. The images from the left eye are interpreted by the right cerebral hemisphere and those from the right eye by the left cerebral hemisphere. Binocular vision occurs when the visual fields of both eyes overlap so that the fovea of both eyes are focused on the same object. It forms the basis of stereoscopic vision. First, as the object approaches, both eyes track it in a process called convergence. Convergence of the eye keeps the image of the object of interest centered on the fovea, the part of the retina where resolution is highest. Should the eyes not converge appropriately, diplopia or double vision occurs. Stereoscopic vision depends upon the eye simultaneously producing slightly different retinal images which the brain resolves as an image. It has several advantages over monocular vision, and these include a larger visual field, damage to one eye being compensated for by the other. For example, it cancels the effects of the blind spot, provides much more accurate assessment of the distance, depth, height, and width of the object. Next is accommodation of the eye, and this is the adjustment of the eye structures to bring an image from a near or far object into sharp focus on the retina. The minimum distance at which the object can be seen most distinctly without strain is called the least distance of distinct vision or near point of the eye. In a normal adult eye, this is around 25 centimeters. The farthest point up to which an eye can see objects clearly is called the far point of the eye, and its infinity for a normal eye. Accommodation of a close object. The ciliary muscles contract, thereby relaxing the tension on the suspensory ligaments. The curvature of the lens increases, that is, the close objects are greatly refracted by the lens, focusing them on the retina. Accommodation of a distant object. The ciliary muscles relax, thereby increasing the tension of the suspensory ligaments. This stretches the lens, decreasing their curvature, that is, the lens becomes thinner. Light rays from a far object are less refracted and hence focused on the retina. Defects of the eye. These are structural changes in the eye which make the focusing mechanism of the eye difficult. Short-sightedness or myopia. This is a condition in which light rays from a distant object are brought to focus in front of the retina, while those from a near object are clearly focused on it. This is caused by a long ball. It may also be due to too much refractive power of the eye lens. Short-sightedness is corrected by wearing concave or diverging lenses. The concave lenses diverge light rays before reaching the eye lens, which then focus the light rays on the retina. Long-sightedness or hypermetropia. This is a condition in which light rays from a near object are not brought to focus by the time they reach the retina, while those from a distant object are clearly focused. It is caused by a too short eyeball or a weak lens system. The disorder can be corrected by wearing a convex or converging lens. This lens refracts light rays before reaching the eye lens, thereby enhancing refraction in order to focus rays sharply onto the retina.
Without many of these discoveries and inventions, few of us would be alive today. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we're counting down our picks for the top 10 greatest medical breakthroughs in history. Number 4. Insulin. In the early 1920s, Canadian medical scientist Sir Frederick Banting, along with medical student Charles Best, identified the hormone insulin. Their experiments eventually led to a successful treatment for people suffering from the disorder in which the pancreas cannot properly regulate the body's blood sugar levels, known as diabetes. Though not a cure, insulin has enabled many diabetics to live longer and less complicated lives without fear of early death.